So we're now still looking at the ovary, but we're going to look at follicle development. And this is what you see if you look at the ovary. So if you were to, as done in lab, um, look at the histology of an ovary, like shown below here, you would see what you can see is the follicle developing. There's places where you can see an oocyte, but primarily what you're seeing down here are various stages of follicular development. A follicle is structure that supports the developing oocyte. In this case, follicles, there's different types of follicles. There's thyroid follicles that also secrete stuff. So folliculogenesis is the production of ovarian follicles which support oocyte development, and they themselves have produce hormones that are going to be important as well. So these little things out here, you can see three of them at least. These are the most immature stage of follicle development. These are called primordial follicles. Those are going to develop into primary, then secondary, and eventually fully mature follicles are called tertiary follicles. So there's various stages shown here. This is kind of one of the largest ones. This would be a mature follicle. That still contains an oocyte at a different stage of development. And you actually can't see it in this one. Um, if you zoomed in, you could see oocytes within some of these. So we're going to look at the stages of development to go from primordial to mature in more detail now. Notice this is a developmental process. So there's various stages that I'm not going to draw like every single potential change. There's going to be some jumps. And if you look at a histology section, you may be looking at something that looks slightly different than the textbook. Okay, one more thing on the slide, because I wanted to say it multiple times. The primordial follicle, it's going to contain a primary oocyte. By the time we get to a mature follicle, this is going to be a secondary oocyte, which is haploid. We'll look at that along with our folliculogenesis as well. So let's draw out folliculogenesis. We're starting with a primordial follicle. That contains a primary oocyte. Primordial follicles are present before birth and continue to be present because not all cells, actually, I'm sorry, I want to use one color lighter than that. Not all cells develop like at puberty, just like the oocytes, not all follicles are going to develop all at one time. So you saw in that previous histology section of an adult ovaries what that was. There are still primordial follicles present. But all primordial follicles that are going to exist are going to be present before birth, so in utero. Okay. Add that in. So beginning around puberty, just before, follicles can start developing into primary follicles. Not all of them do at once, right? This happens throughout life until menopause. So starting and then through menopause. Different primordial follicles will develop at different times, anywhere between, 12 years old, whenever it starts, to 30, potentially 40 years old. Okay, now we still have granulosa cells. The changes that have occurred are those granulosa cells. Notice these are individual cells. I forgot to label them. They were pretty squamous in the primordial follicle. Now they've become fairly cuboidal. I'm gonna draw them as circles because that's a lot easier, and that's how I'll draw them from here out. Still individual cells with nuclei. I'm not gonna draw all the nuclei. We also, within the primary follicle, the other change is we've got this thing called the zona pellucida. It's kind of a membrane around the oocyte that's important for fertilization. Okay, so that process could begin beginning at puberty. Then we have further development to secondary follicles. Again, each month, it's a month for humans. This would occur to a subset of the follicles. The secondary follicle is going to have more than one layer of granulosa cells. So instead of that single layer, we're increasing the number of granulosa cells. This is going to increase support for the developing oocyte, as well as the granulosa cells are going to be producing estrogen. So you'll see in the next video, we'll have increased estrogen as the follicle develops. In addition to, okay, first let me draw the zona pellucida again, because it's still there. It is actually a little space there. In addition to the granulosa cells, we also have another cell type called theca cells. Also nuclei in here that surround the follicle in a single layer. Okay. Last thing about the secondary follicles, again, this is a process over time. They're starting to produce, the granulosa cells not only produce estrogen, but also start producing antrum, which is a fluid that's going to take up physical space in the mature follicle, and maturing, and eventually in the mature follicle takes up the maximum space that it's going to. So I'll draw that in the next here. I'm going to draw a tertiary follicle. Next, again, there's steps, and you'll see if you look at the histology, various follicles in development along these time points. A tertiary follicle, in addition to changing the follicle, we've also are going to go through meiosis one. So now we have, this is our secondary oocyte that's embedded in the follicle. There's all this fluid that's been produced called antrum. And then we still have lots of layers of granulosa cells. And theca cells as well. Just going to draw them like this. And this actually is more than one layer now. So the follicle has gotten larger. This is probably not perfectly to scale. The primordial follicle is probably even smaller than I've drawn here. But the whole follicle has gotten larger, resulting in more hormone production, more antrum production, and so large that eventually is going to burst. So a tertiary follicle is also called a mature follicle. You'll also see it called an antral follicle because it's so full of antrum. It's going to burst. This is called ovulation. So the oocyte itself is separated from the follicle. The oocyte, if fertilized, becomes ovum. If not, just kind of degrades. And then the follicle is going to form, basically degrade, and form what's called the corpus luteum. it still would have like the remnants of those granulosa cells and fecal cells. It's typically drawn like that. We'll come back to this as well. It's actually going to produce high progesterone. We'll see that in the next slide. Okay. Um, every cycle, um, multiple primary follicles develop into secondary and then tertiary follicles. Only one will be ovulated. The other ones go through what's called the atresia, which is degeneration. So basically, follicles are lost along the way, along with their oocytes. That's fine. We got plenty. We typically only ovulate one each cycle, although sometimes two eggs or more are released, and sometimes that results in twins or more. So dizygotic twins. Learning check here. And then I do want to show you this image. This ties together the two side by side, so oogenesis and folliculogenesis. And this is directly addressing a learning outcome.